This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on.
I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell?
What the hell is going on is I was reading my favorite newspaper the other day, the Pacific Daily News.
Oh, of course.
And the flagship paper of the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands.
Right.
It reported that every year the first baby born on American soil on Guam and in the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands is celebrated. This year, however, is quite different because a 30-year-old tourist from Shanghai, China gave birth to the first baby of 2025 in the U.S. territory. The first American citizen born in 2025, the year of the second Trump presidency, was a birth tourist baby from China. And there was a whole problem within the Northern Marianas Islands where there was a whole industry built around Chinese citizens and other people coming into the Northern Marianas Islands to give birth to children so that their kids could be U.S. citizens. The statistics show that in 2023, 250,000 children were born to illegal immigrants here in the United States. That's 7% of all births. Over the course of the Biden administration, if you extrapolate that, that's 1 million American citizens that were born to parents who entered this country illegally during the border invasion that we've been experiencing over the past 4 years. And so Donald Trump has issued an executive order basically repealing birthright citizenship for these folks and for people whose mothers are here illegally and whose father is not a U.S. citizen, or also those who are here legally but temporarily, but not U.S. citizens. And he's citing the language in the 14th Amendment saying that people who are under the jurisdiction thereof do not receive U.S. citizenship. I don't think that what he's done passes constitutional muster, and I think it's going to be litigated, but I think it's absolutely outrageous that people can sneak into this country illegally, violate our laws, and have children in the U.S., and meanwhile, somebody who's waiting in line patiently to get into this country like our parents did, or like you did. You're an immigrant. My mother was an immigrant, came here legally. But those people, might not get their visa in time, and their kids are born in Honduras or in Poland or in Australia, and they don't get citizenship. So we're rewarding lawlessness, and we're punishing people who follow the law. And those people get to stay here because their children are American citizens. They don't get deported. I think this is absolute insanity, Danny.
So I'm with you. I don't think that what Donald Trump did passes constitutional muster. And unlike our executive branch, one of the reasons that I say that is because I always think about the precedent it sets, right? I always think about, I don't care, okay, Donald Trump did this, yahoo! But what is the next president going to do? What is he going to take out of the Constitution? What is he going to read out? So that's a very important element for our rule of law. And so I agree with you. But I also agree with you. Birthright tourism and illegal aliens being permitted to have the privileges of birthright citizenship for their children seems to me to be so morally wrong. And it's very interesting because I think where you sit on this depends where you stand. When you talk to constitutional scholars, even conservative constitutional scholars, and I've been looking at what people, our guest thinks, but also what people like John Yoo think and others, is that they tend to be very, very deferential to the literal language of the Constitution, and even more to the back history of birthright citizenship, which was born out of a desire to deny citizenship to blacks and their children who were brought over as slaves.
Yes.
Right? And so,
which the executive order cites, by the way, as a positive that they were allowed to have citizenship.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. But look, I think this is wrong. I think it's ridiculous, actually, and I think that it undermines the rule of law in the United States. I think it undermines support for a legal process of immigration. And I think that a legal process of immigration is one of the most important things that defines a country, right? I want to underscore this even further from what everybody knows to be my particular perspective, which is I look at France, I look at the UK, I look at Germany, I look at Australia, and what I see is that there are hundreds of thousands, and in many cases, millions of Muslim immigrants who have come in illegally in the case of Germany, or under the guise of being refugees, or with no intention of leaving, and who change the nature and character of the country.
Yeah, these countries are committing suicide by immigration.
I don't think that they're committing. I think that in some cases it is simply that these countries are so denuded of national identity that there's nothing for people to assimilate to, right? There's in Australia, people are intended to be embarrassed by citizenship and by love of country. If you could have seen, last Sunday was Australia Day, which is, like the 4th of July, right? And it commemorates the arrival of the ships at Botany Bay in what is now New South Wales. And if you could see the placards, guys, Australia is evil, burn Australia to the ground, Invasion Day. I mean, when people are taught to hate their country, immigrants are never going to assimilate. Then they are going to be the other in these societies. I thank God that we are not quite there yet, but this is what's happened to Europe. But we're headed there. That's exactly right. It's one of the reasons why Donald Trump won.
In New York City, with pro-Hamas marches in New York City. I mean, it's not as bad as it is in London, where an entire segment of the population, a significant portion of the population, thinks that Britain is evil and supports Hamas. But we're getting there. It's certainly a significant portion of the population of Harvard and the population of Columbia that feels that way. We shouldn't be letting people into our country who hate America. And if they do, then we should deport them.
I mean, but, we had a lot of clarity about this during the Cold War, right? Are you or have you ever been
a member of the
Communist Party, right?
Can I just deflect with a funny anecdote? Because when we were in the 1990s working on the Foreign Relations Committee, and then I joined the Bush administration, we were doing our SF-86, which is your security clearance form. And the question used to be, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And they got rid of that out of political correctness and changed it to, do you hate any particular groups of people? And so
did you like communists?
And so no, I said no, and then they interviewed my friend Mark Wheat about that, and you refused to answer the question because you said it had nothing to do with the security clearance, which I'm sure really helped me. But my friend Mark Wheat was asked that question: does he hate any groups of people? And he said, "Oh yes." And they said, "Who?" And he said, "Communists."
It's true. We digress. Anyway, you and I have completely digressed. But one thing that we invited our guests on to talk about this. But one thing is clear, and that is that our system and the way it works is broken. In a normal world, we would have a proper deliberative process. The executive branch would know its place. Congress would defend its prerogatives. And instead, what we have now is a unitary government in which the White House is king. And again, lots of people will be applauding and saying, "Oh yeah, great, Donald Trump is king." Hey guys, Donald Trump is serving one term.
Yes, but you know what? And again, I disagree with this executive order because I think he should have asked for legislation from Congress to do this. And we should have a debate and go through the proper channels and do this. I'm less comfortable with the second part of the executive order about people who are legally here but not permanent residents. But I certainly think that illegal immigrants' children should not be getting birthright citizenship. But that's a question that Congress should address, and then the court should decide what the Constitution says and whether the Congress has the right to do that. And I think that's the proper procedure. But one of the things that Trump is doing is he's sort of taking a hammer to the anvil because people are just tired of things. It seems for most Americans like that's just common sense, right? That you don't violate our laws and get rewarded with citizenship for it. And we got to restore common sense. And What I worry about is the lack of common sense is dramatically undermining support for legal immigration in this country.
That's exactly
If
right.
you look at the Gallup poll, when Trump was president in it last time around, supermajorities of Americans believe that immigration, legal immigration, should either be increased or kept at the present level, and only a small number thought that it should be decreased. Today, it's the reverse. Support for keeping or maintaining current levels has dropped, and support for reducing it is at 55%.
Right. And by the way, that's not at all a white supremacy thing. That is the view
No.
of majorities of Latinos
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. We've got supermajorities of Americans who say that we should deport criminal aliens. So, New York Times poll, deport immigrants who are here illegally and have committed criminal records, 87% support. Deport illegal immigrants who are here illegally and arrived over the last 4 years, 63%. Deporting all immigrants who are here illegally, 55% majority. Now, only 41% want to end birthright citizenship. But that's higher.
That's still a pretty big number.
That's a pretty big number. So all these people who say that they're pro-immigration, who allowed the floodgates to open up, you built this. And I understand why Americans want to
Oh, sure, me too.
to stop to reduce numbers of migration, because there's a million new citizens here who shouldn't be citizens because they should have never been here to begin with. We've got to fix this problem. I don't know that this executive order is the right way to do it. Maybe it causes litigation that comes to some conclusion out of it, and it forces the issue, but we just can't pretend that this is okay.
So let me throw out an element of this to you and see what you think. And I should have done so with Adam, but I only thought of it now. So you remember during the Obama administration that the Obama administration ended the practice of what was called rendition, right? Which is going to a foreign country, kidnapping an Al-Qaeda bad guy, and then rendering them to a third country. And they ended that practice, and they decided that they were going to bring these guys to the United States and to try them here. And the argument that was subsequently made was, right, and these guys have all the rights and privileges and protections of Americans. And the answer was, what? Yeah, I'm sorry, what? You're grabbing Osama bin Laden, bringing him to the country, and then treating him like an American with constitutional protections? And there was outrage at this, and you wrote about it at the time. But why is it that there are people who are pretty comfortable with the idea that we don't give terrorists the rights and privileges of Americans because they are here simply as a part of a process, but we are fine with giving illegal aliens the rights and privileges of the Constitution by allowing their children who are born here to become citizens?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, Danny. I mean, maybe we ask John Yoo at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious.
He knows a lot about both policies.
It's true. Anyway, I want to touch on one last thing before we go to our guest, and this is something big that we talk about, which is the complete disappearance of Congress. Congress is just like, it's not a thing anymore. That Congress has been increasingly supine. And I'm talking about, I have a lot of respect for Speaker Johnson.
Same.
Ditto for Mitch McConnell and John Thune. And I wish I could say the same for Chuck Schumer, but I can't. But what the hell is wrong with them? And this is a bipartisan slam. Why are they not standing up to protect their privileges against the White House?
Well, I'll tell you right now, it's because Donald Trump was elected in a swing state sweep and has a popular vote mandate, and they want him to be successful. And so they're going to choose their fights wisely with him in terms of when they're going to disagree.
I bet they're not going to choose their fights wisely. I bet they're not going to choose any fights.
Well, we'll see. But I think the attitude is that we just went through possibly the worst 4 years of presidential leadership in our lifetimes, and there's a lot to fix, and we got to get to fixing it. And so this is a structural problem that needs to be fixed. Congress needs to reassert itself. But right now, it's low on the totem pole of things that need to get fixed in the eyes of a lot of folks up there.
All right, let's go to our guest. So Adam White is the Lawrence H. Silberman, the late Judge Silberman's chair in
Who married you?
Who married me and Stephen. That's correct.
Yeah.
People should not infer that I married Judge Silberman. Chair in Constitutional Governance and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, that fine think tank. He focuses on the Supreme Court and the administrative state. Concurrently, he co-directs the Antonin Scalia Law School's C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Before joining AEI, he was a research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and an adjunct at the Manhattan Institute.
And when you say a judge married you, most people don't assume he's the groom, Danny. But anyway, here's our interview. Well, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Well, good. It's great to have you for the first time. We're happy you're here. And never better time because we have two presidents, the outgoing and the incoming, who seem to be changing the Constitution by executive action. And you have the outgoing Biden administration, which declared that the Equal Rights Amendment is now the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. And then you have the Trump administration coming in, which has changed birthright citizenship. I don't want to dwell too much on the Biden administration because they're gone and we're in a new era. But let me just ask you, is there a 28th Amendment to the Constitution?
No, Mark, there is no 28th Amendment. It's definitely not the Equal Rights Amendment, if there ever will be a 28th Amendment. And I think it is sort of amazing. We're accustomed to an era of presidential supremacy in our political process. But as you point out, the last few weeks have been just astonishing. They'd be even more astonishing if we hadn't been sort of slowly boiling the constitutional frog the last several decades with this ever-growing scope of presidential power. This is really astonishing what we've seen.
So, for me, the Equal Rights Amendment, I mean, I remember, God, you remember those buttons that people used to wear? Adam, you're probably too young, or maybe you're not, but I remember when, it was such a big feminist thing. For me, the Equal Rights Amendment is not intrinsically interesting. There's no question. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, this is a dead letter. They'd have to start the process again. We are decades away from the open window. What's interesting to me is that it so clearly symbolizes the divorce between the constitutional reality and the White House's decision making. And, if we look back, and I think it'd be worthwhile starting with Biden. If we look back over the Biden administration, that was really only the capstone of a presidency that ignored Congress, ignored the judiciary. Remember the student loan debacle. Can you just talk a little bit about this problem during the Biden administration?
Yeah, and I would trace it even slightly earlier to the Obama administration. Now, again, of course, presidential power has been increasing for a very, very long time. But as I wrote for Commentary Magazine last year, there came a moment, I think it was the second half of the last term for President Obama, right after Republicans regained control of Congress and President Obama announced, I have a pen and I have a phone and I'm going to use it. And you saw this sweeping effort to suddenly impose enormous new policies just unilaterally, either through new regulations, right, Clean Power Plan, net neutrality, and so on, or through non-enforcement of laws, right, DACA, the immigration laws. That seemed to me a tipping point of a kind, the moment when suddenly this last few decades of the growth of presidential power really became the center of gravity, without question, in American policymaking. And of course, President Trump tried to do some of that in his first term. Maybe the biggest example was when he announced he wanted border wall funding, and he just wanted to sort of reallocate funds to a border wall himself. And you saw members of Congress, Republicans in Congress, cheering him on. But President Biden, I do think, took it to a new level. And furthermore, I think he came to recognize that these assertions of presidential power, even when thwarted by the courts, can be enormously successful politically, that picking a fight with the court is often a winning fight for the president, even if he technically loses the fight. So student loans are a classic example. President Biden announced this obviously illegal sort of permanent waiver of student loans. He loses resoundingly in the Supreme Court, and as a number of our colleagues in other departments of AEI have documented, like Nat Malkus and Beth Akers, President Biden only doubled down with further student loan forgiveness under other statutes. And this announcement at the end of his term, the very last few days, that the Equal Rights Amendment was somehow part of the Constitution, even though it's not been ratified by enough states, was really sort of the cherry on top of a very unconstitutional Sunday.
So you reminded me, but I got to say, and I don't mean to flog an unfortunately not that dead horse, but it really does strike me the more and more I think about the presidency in this century, how Barack Obama was the sort of fons et origo of all bad things that are happening. It does even in foreign policy, Iran, but so much more as well, ISIS. Anyway, but I digress. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about DACA because I think that Barack Obama's decision on DACA is actually hugely important for Donald Trump and his TikTok decision. Right? Can you pull that thread out so that our listeners can understand what Obama did and this concept, and give us your thoughts about the legality of it?
Well, after President Obama said for a year or two in his administration that he couldn't just wave a magic wand and give illegal immigrants legal status in the U.S., he finally found that wand. It was next to the pen on the phone, and he started waving it, announcing that through a Justice Department memo and a DHS, a Department of Homeland Security memo, that children, and eventually their parents too, who arrived in the U.S., would not be subject to the full force of immigration law in terms of removing them from the U.S. It didn't make them citizens. It didn't give them visas, but it gave them this other sort of amorphous status by the mere fact that the law wouldn't be enforced against them. That's very hard for courts. I'll just say at the outset, it's very hard for courts to overcome. It's easy for a court to tell an administration, stop doing that bad thing. It's much harder for a court to say to an administration, start doing the right thing. Like the courts can't actually get out there and start enforcing immigration laws. And so even after a lot of concern was raised in the courts about DACA, and there would have been a Supreme Court decision on the issue had Justice Scalia not passed away unexpectedly in 2016, there's just no good way for the courts to force the enforcement of laws outside of very narrow circumstances. And that's what we see with TikTok as well. You have a very straightforward and clear law passed with overwhelming support in both houses of Congress, both political parties, and signed by President Biden. And it has an explicit provision for delaying the effectiveness of the law if it seems like there's progress towards a divestiture of TikTok. And just in a nutshell, what the law does is it prohibits Apple and Google and if there were other platforms like that, from distributing TikTok and anything else that qualifies as foreign adversary controlled application. So it's a law that says, Apple, Google, you can't make this available to the people until TikTok is divested from Chinese control into another company. If that actually were playing out, there's a way for President Trump to certify that progress is being made, and he can delay it for 90 days. President Trump didn't have any patience for that. In fact, even before he became president, he filed a brief in the Supreme Court urging the Supreme Court to not rule on the case, where the court ultimately did rule unanimously that the TikTok ban, the Chinese ownership ban, was legal. President Trump has been trying to delay this since before he even came to office. And immediately upon arriving in office, he issues a memorandum saying that he's going to defer any enforcement of this TikTok law for another 75 days. So President Trump isn't purporting to nullify the law altogether. He's not saying the law isn't a law. He's not pretending that the words in the law don't mean what they mean. What he's saying, and I actually thought that while I disagree with the order, he has a fairly reasonable way of making the argument. He says, as president, he is constitutionally responsible for the nation's national security, and that the timing of this law's application creates real challenges for the newly inaugurated president to carry out those constitutional duties. So he doesn't say he'll never enforce this law. He says that so that he can be a proper constitutional steward of our national security, he needs some time to think through how this will work, to analyze it, and perhaps to renegotiate parts of it. And he says, where I think he gets out a little bit over his skis, is he says, not only will the Justice Department not enforce this for 75 days, but the Justice Department shall never enforce any kind of penalties that would accrue against Apple and Google during that sort of safe harbor 75-day period. I don't think he can do that. I don't think a president can say that no Justice Department will ever enforce the penalties that are accruing right now. There's interesting due process issues that would arise that maybe Apple and Google could raise if a future J.D. Vance or Gina Raimondo administration tried to enforce this TikTok law all the way back to January 20th of 2025. But I think President Trump has shown that there is some possible space here for him to maneuver. I think on the whole, though, it's a terrible idea to go about it this way. Even if there's a reasonable argument in favor of this, it's just, as you pointed out when you teed this up, the latest example of a president saying, I have amorphous constitutional power that enables me to just disavow or ignore the plain text of a statute simply because I'm the president.
Giving the benefit of the doubt that Trump has the best of intentions here, and that what he wants to do, I'm just for sake of argument, that what he wants to do here is to find a way to save TikTok while divesting it, following the intent of the law of divesting it of Chinese ownership. I don't think any of us would have, we'd have other problems with TikTok continuing, even if it wasn't owned by the Chinese Communist Party, or indirectly. But, let's say that's his goal, right? He's doing something that might have a good public policy purpose, but doing it the wrong way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I have to say at the outset, there's always the talk about, do you take President Trump seriously or literally? I've always said it's best to take him neither seriously nor literally, but hypothetically. Here's what we're doing here. Hypothetically, if President Trump really were thinking just exclusively in terms of the national interest and national security, I still think that there's just too much water under the bridge. He's already said at length that he's changed his mind, in part because of his political success on TikTok. I do understand that presidents do need to have some points of leverage in negotiation with foreign countries, especially now with China. It was Chief Justice John Marshall who a long time ago said that the president is our sole organ of diplomacy. He's in charge of the State Department and everything else that's involved in diplomacy. And so, of course, we want the president to have some leverage. But here where there is explicitly a clear framework for the kind of considerations that President Trump has raised, clear framework for delaying this for another 90 days if there's progress. Part of that reflects poorly on the Biden administration, I just want to say, that the point was that the whole process was supposed to start before the January 19th date. It's not just President Biden and his administration. They shouldn't have just been sitting around waiting for things to happen and then getting to January 19th saying, oh, this is complicated, and handing it over to President Trump like a giant stinky bag of garbage. He was actually supposed to be making progress on this whole time. But even despite that, President Trump just coming into office and announcing that he won't enforce it for 75 days for very amorphous reasons, I think that doesn't even reach the bare minimum of what a president ought to be doing in this situation, which is making a clear and straightforward case for what he actually intends to do, how he actually would measure success, how he actually would enforce the letter and spirit of the law that Congress passed and another president signed. That's what a president needs to do when he's taking care to faithfully execute the laws. And the amorphous, ambiguous sort of commitments that President Trump spells out in this executive order fell far short of that.
Yeah, no, I framed it that way for a reason as a segue to our next subject, because I agree with you that he doesn't have the authority to do what he's doing, even if you accept that what he's trying to do is the right thing, which is to save the platform while fulfilling the intent of the divestiture. But the reason I frame it that way is because that seems to be also what he's doing when it comes to birthright citizenship, right? So a lot of us, I think Danny and I included, think that it's absolutely ridiculous that Chinese tourists can come to Saipan and have a baby on a tourist visa, and that baby's an American citizen, even if they're here legally, or that illegal immigrants can pour over our border, have children, and those children get to be U.S. citizens. But I'm not sure that his executive order reversing that is legal. He has the legal authority to do that. So even if you agree with the logic of what he's trying to do, I'm not sure that the law is where he wants it to be. Can you sort of walk us through that?
Yeah, and I'll just say, since I'm new to the show as a guest, I mean, I disagree with a lot of the premise of that, of the way you framed it in terms of birthright citizenship. I'm much, much more in favor of birthright citizenship, even in a lot of the harder cases that, of course, have been made harder by just the sheer volume of immigration from up through the Mexican border, and also, as you said, sort of the tactical use of visas to sort of support birth tourism.
Oh, and by the way, can I just jump in
Yeah.
because one of our, the as we going back to how Obama is the root of all evil. In 2015, they issued an executive action saying that people coming here to give birth should be treated no differently than any tourist coming in for any medical procedure, which opened the gates up to birth tourism. So Obama once again is the root of the problem.
In terms of how to think through what's happening right now with this, as I'm sure most or all of your listeners know, the current form of birthright citizenship that we have, that anybody born in the U.S., with very limited exceptions, they are automatically a citizen of the United States, regardless of their parents' status in the United States. That dates back more than 1.25 centuries, almost exactly 1.25 centuries, to 1898 in the case of Wong Kim Ark. He was a Chinese man. He was born in San Francisco of Chinese immigrant parents, born in the U.S., traveled back and forth to China when he became an adult, and was stopped upon re-entry by enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Supreme Court ruled in that case that no, Wong Kim Ark was a U.S. citizen, regardless of his parents' status. He was born in the U.S. And the court was relying on the 14th Amendment, which says all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are entitled to the full rights of citizenship. The crux of the argument, going back for 150 years, almost 150 years now, is what do we mean by that? Subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Is somebody whose parents come here illegally, maybe with no intention at all of staying in the U.S., the parents have no intention of staying in the U.S., is their child still a U.S. citizen? What the Supreme Court held in that case in 1898 was, yes, if you're born in the U.S., unless you are the child of a diplomat or maybe the child of a soldier or some other invading force, and I think invasion is where we'll litigate this now going forward. No, you as the child are still subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. I think that I know we'll get to the new executive order in a second, but I just want to say, I think that has to be right, by the way, the right interpretation. Indeed, the Trump administration itself argues that so many of these people in the U.S., they're subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S., they're subject to the criminal laws. Nobody, if the child of illegal immigrants grows up and commits a murder, no one would say that person isn't subject to the criminal laws, that person has some kind of diplomatic immunity or some other immunity. That's how the court read this subject to the jurisdiction thereof point in 1898. I think that's how they'll read it now. But now the argument will really be forced in the courts because of this executive order, where President Trump, I think, leaning on the notion that what's happening at the southern border is not just a tidal wave of illegal immigration, but something closer to an outright invasion, although it's not clear exactly what the term means as he uses it, that children born to those immigrants, those illegal immigrants, they don't automatically receive birthright citizenship, and that there should be sort of further tests imposed on them to make sure that they actually qualify as citizens under the sort of broader sense of allegiance to the U.S. There were rumblings of an executive order like this during the last Trump administration. At least I knew people in and around the administration were advocating for this. So I'm not surprised by it. But in the same way that I really am sort of disheartened or astonished by what President Biden tried to do as he was leaving office, this strikes me as another example of the worst kind of presidential power or assertions of presidential power, because it so sweepingly and dramatically casts real questions over the legal status of any number of people, right? It creates enormous uncertainty. The executive order tries to dampen that uncertainty for people who are already here.
It's perspective as of February 18th.
Its application is perspective, but the constitution or legal theory underlying it is certainly not, right? If President Trump can actually prevail on his reading of the Constitution when they're defending this executive order, that will raise enormous questions about others who are already in the United States. And so instead of announcing that he wanted a change in legislation, change our naturalization laws, or something like that, that would maybe play this out in a slower and more prospective way, what he's done is created enormous uncertainty for anybody who's born here after January 20th, and also less but still significant uncertainty for perhaps millions of other people who are already here.
Right. I mean, and we are seriously talking about millions. Apparently, the Center for Immigration Studies said that there were between 225,000 and 250,000 U.S. births to illegal immigrants in 2023, which accounts for about 7% of births in the United States that year. Damn. That's not, and by the way, that's not birth tourism. Those are people who fully intend to stay here in the United States. So before we dive into some of the facts and figures on this, because we should stay with this question of birthright citizenship, I think it's important that people understand, or even more important that I understand, the provenance of this constitutional provision. I wasn't born in the United States. I'm not a natural born American, as the Colonel said of Elvis and his singing.
They're working on you, Danny.
And I don't really get this. This isn't the case in most other countries that you go there and have a baby and that baby is a citizen. What were the founders thinking here?
Well, by the way, I'll just say it to the extent that I actually don't know how broad birthright citizenship is around the world, but if it were only to exist in one country, of course it would be the United States because we're the best country and it's a great idea. This birthright citizenship, it doesn't go all the way back in terms of constitutional text. It doesn't go all the way back to the original founding. From those early decades, the antebellum era, it's much more nebulous. But after the Supreme Court ruled in the 1850s in the infamous Dred Scott case that blacks, slave or otherwise, were never intended to be citizens or have the rights of citizens under the U.S. Constitution. After that case was decided and the Civil War was fought and won by the North and the post-war amendments were ratified, the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution is what created this explicit textual right in the Constitution to citizenship. It's the Section 1 of the 14th Amendment is where you get this phrase about all persons born in the United States or naturalized are entitled to the full rights of citizenship. It was, first and foremost, obviously an effort to overturn the Dred Scott decision and make clear that Dred Scott himself and all other black men and women in America, slave or otherwise, were citizens. But it didn't limit it on its face to that. It went much, much more broadly. It just said all persons. So it's possible, of course, that the people who ratified that provision in the 1860s, that they didn't appreciate the scope of immigration just decades later. It's quite possible, obviously. Many, many more people have started coming to America from many more places. I don't assume that they would have written it completely the same way in the 1860s, but they wrote what they wrote. And I think they got it right that, again, when you threw out that number before, 225,000 in the last year or something, 7% of all births. I mean, it's an astonishing number. And as somebody who likes America and American culture generally the way it is, obviously that much of a wave of immigration from other countries, as a conservative, sort of unsettles me in a way of the practical effects it might have. But in the end, I think the real greatness of the 14th Amendment and its overturning of Dred Scott is making clear that here in America, if you're born here and you want to be a citizen, you want to stay here, we welcome you, we want you here, we want to remain a growing country where we're bringing people from around the world, including the children of people who are willing to go through enormous ordeals and at great risk to bring themselves into this country and raise American children. I still think that's one of our greatest features, despite its obvious challenges that it poses.
It's a very substantial number of countries. More than half the countries in the world actually allow birthright citizenship with various conditions, and some have terminated it. But I'm interested in this. On the one hand, Adam, I'm very sympathetic to what you say. This is the greatest country in the world, and people who want to be part of the greatest country in the world, yay, that's a great thing. But there's another element of this, and without sounding, first of all, without exaggerating, without sounding bigoted, a lot of people come here and engage in birthright citizenship tourism.
Yeah.
For the purpose of grifting off of the welfare state.
Yes.
And I don't think that's great. It doesn't make me feel good as an American. It doesn't make me feel good as a taxpayer. And I guess I'll be honest with you and say I can't divide. I don't know how many of those people are like, I just love America so much and I want to be part of its future, which I think is an amazing thing. And the other half, which is I'm a huge believer in American welfare and American Medicaid. And I'm going to go back to Bolivia and have my relatives stick my welfare check in a bank account in America, which is a story that I happen to know. And that's a problem. And I don't know how we split that hair.
Yeah, and given that I just gave sort of my ode to illegal immigration a moment ago, let's be really clear here. Notwithstanding everything I just said, there is something deeply unsettling about people sort of knowingly violating our immigration laws, coming here, sort of jumping the line in front of everybody else who go through the process. Just yesterday, I was talking with a man who's one of our allies in Afghanistan, and all the ordeals he went through to come to the United States with his wife and kids, or his one kid. Now they have four, three of whom are born American citizens. That it seems very unfair to everybody else who wants to come to this country through the right means. So I don't denigrate that. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the border and also through our visa process to make birth tourism harder through the granting of visas. All of that needs to be done. But the question is, what happens when all of that fails and people get into the country illegally and a child is born here, right? I think, especially given the text of the Constitution, we have to kind of shield our eyes to everything leading up to the birth of that child. The Constitution is aimed at the rights of the person that was born here, the child. And then you get the harder question about what to do with their parents. Because frankly, once the child is born here, do we really want to separate the family and send the parents home to Honduras or Mexico and then have this child who's an American citizen here? Do we want to force that child and his or her parents to make the enormously difficult choice about whether the American children stay here and the parents go home? I would hope that our country would err on the side of mercy and notwithstanding the fact their parents broke the law to come here, to allow the parents to stay. I wish our written laws were much more explicit on that. But I don't sort of give short shrift to the fact that these questions become enormously hard. They reflect the illegal choices of people who came into the country illegally and the sort of failures of government who should be better enforcing our immigration laws. But for me, the question of birthright citizenship really has to start with the rights of the child and then make those harder prudential cases backing out. One thing that really worries me about President Trump's birthright citizenship order is that it does seem, and I think their immigration policy in general is going to be geared towards encouraging not just the parents to flee the country, but their American children, which I understand sort of the tactical calculus behind it, but I find it pretty horrifying when you begin with the premise, at least, that these children born in America are Americans.
Adam, I have to kind of push back on you on that. And I think that's just not where the country is right now. And it feeds into the whole theory of the left that they're going to permanently change our politics through demography, right? They're going to let in all these illegal migrants into the country. And there are people on the right who buy into this, that, we're letting all these legal migrants come in. Yeah, they can't vote, but their kids are going to be American citizens and they're all going to vote for Democrats. And we're kind of change the country that way. I think most Americans look and say that it's fundamentally unjust that a person violates our immigration laws, sneaks into the country, has a child, and that child is a U.S. citizen, when somebody in Honduras who lined up at the U.S. consulate to wait for a visa had their child in Honduras because they weren't yet approved and apply. Their kid is not a U.S. citizen. Why should people be rewarded with citizenship for their children who violate our laws? And why should we not deport those people because they managed to have a child in the United States? I mean, that's just... and believe me, I'm a child of immigrants, first and second generation, and my mother and father. And one of the problems we're having, Adam, is that over the course of the Biden administration, with this flood of illegal migrants coming into the country, it's dramatically decreased for the first time in years support for legal immigration. And so if we can't have common sense policies about these sorts of things, when you say to an American, yeah, they snuck in, but they were born here in the United States, so their kids should be able to be an American citizen, and they should be able to stay because their kid's an American citizen. People think we're nuts, and that our policy is broken, and we've got to just stop letting people into the country. and it's hurting the cause of legal immigration, which I care deeply about.
Now, the points are well taken, Mark, and I'm not trying to denigrate. We'll put it this way: I'm much more lenient on the immigration question. That you're either you're the children of immigrants, or Danny, what'd you say? You're an immigrant yourself. My family, at least the part of my family I know about, arrived from Germany in the 1860s, and so I'm about as natural born as they come, I guess, outside of the Mayflower generation. So it is interesting that with those backgrounds, we're on these particular sides of these issues. But to what you just said, though, Mark, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I'll just say again, it's obviously bad conduct on the part of the parents for violating the immigration laws. But when I think about the child that's born in the U.S., you ask people, why are you an American? Most of us who are natural-born Americans, we wouldn't say, well, I'm an American because my parents are Americans, right? It's, I'm an American because I was the only place I've ever been. I was born here. There's something, I think, at root to most Americans' instincts about their own citizenship, that it's not about who their parents are. If anything, America is a country where who your parents are should matter the least, right? The sort of the small r, deeply Republican nature of our country is to put the most emphasis on the individual and not either give them a title of nobility because of who their parents are or to hold the sins of the father against the child. That's, I think, the best version of America. Obviously, what's happening with immigration, what's been happening for the last, decades upon decades, makes these questions incredibly difficult. But for me, I try to start with the right of the child, and then, like I said, we have to make the harder prudential judgments as we kind of go in the outward circles, beginning with the parents. Can I throw one more thing in, maybe to widen the conversation? Because that last conversation about how we got to this point, it reminded me of something I wanted to bring up with the Equal Rights Amendment. I hope this analogy isn't strained. With the Equal Rights Amendment, we're focusing right now on what President Biden attempted to do in his last days in office. But you think about the history of the politics around the Equal Rights Amendment from the very beginning, right? It's proposed by both houses of Congress in the early 70s. Congress sends it out to the states. You need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. Congress says we're setting a, 10-year deadline for the states to ratify it. And not enough states ratified it. 35 states ratified it. They needed 38, so that was that. And then what you see from then on, from 1982 onward, is just this effort to impose the policy on us through all kinds of ridiculous gamesmanship, right? Some states ratify the law too late. And the supporters of the ERA say, hey, that's great. Congress is not allowed, they say, to send this out to the states with a deadline. It's like the only part of the Equal Rights Amendment that they didn't like was the deadline for its ratification. And then when other states see that this is happening, they, I think 5 or 6 states rescinded their ratifications, some very early in the 1970s, one of the Dakotas as recently as, I think, 2020, 2021. And the Equal Rights Amendments people say, oh, well, states can ratify belatedly, but they can never unratify, right? It's like Hotel California, you can never leave. And then when that doesn't work, they get to this, like the high watermark of this, of course, is saying, well, President Biden should order the archivist of the United States to just announce that it's been ratified. Or President Biden should just cut out the middleman and just announce that it was ratified. It's this broken political process that at the end, its advocates just try to enforce it upon America by force. Same thing with immigration. What we've seen now over decades is after failure of our elected leaders to actually do this the right way, you see it reach a point where administrations are basically trying to weaponize uncertainty. Right, President Obama just suddenly giving this amorphous legal status to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. President Trump trying to unilaterally withdraw birthright citizenship status from people going forward. And then, like I said, implicitly, depending on how this plays out, it'll affect people going backwards. When the political process breaks down so much, we find ourselves in a place where it's not just presidents making the rules themselves, but presidents trying to do this mostly through the weaponization of legal uncertainty as much as through the announcement of new regulations.
So I want to ask you how this plays out legally in the courts and how is it going to happen. But also, Andy McCarthy and Yuval Levin have written on this back in 2018 when Trump was thinking about doing this. And they all seem to, there were a bunch of conservative scholars have said that essentially the Constitution doesn't directly resolve the question of this clause, and that there's actually it's not just the 14th Amendment, but there's Section 1401 of Title 8 U.S. Code, which was passed in 1952, which sort of codified the 14th Amendment, but Congress could the president can't do it unilaterally, but Congress could adjust birthright citizenship because the Constitution isn't exactly clear on that. One, do you think that there's a way that Trump could even, I know you disagree with changing it, but as a legal matter, do you think there is a way for Congress, if there was political will to do this and Trump was doing this the right way, to do this legislatively? And how do you think the executive order plays out?
Well, so you're right that, Congress does have some room here, and I think there'll be a lot of debates going forward about how much room. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment gives Congress the power and responsibility to write laws implementing the rest of the 14th Amendment. So it's not that Congress could sort of negate Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, but to the extent that there's some ambiguity in there about what the terms actually mean, Congress might be able to clarify the meaning of the amendment through legislation. I'm not sure that Congress could do away with birthright citizenship. Maybe if Congress were to legislate some policy to the effect that the immigration from Mexico actually does qualify as an invasion within the meaning of the Constitution and other laws, maybe that would be a way to limit birthright citizenship for the children of people who came up from the southern border. I'm just not sure. I think that's where Congress would have to act. But again, to dovetail with my earlier point, Congress and the rest of the government's at its best when it's clarifying legal questions rather than creating them. And so anything that Congress can do to help clarify the meaning of the 14th Amendment would be a good thing, but again, within limits, because they can't just simply negate the 14th Amendment altogether, and you'd have arguments over whether it's a clarification or a negation. Now, of course, in the meantime, litigation is playing out. A judge in Seattle, he was appointed by Reagan in '81, which is kind of amazing when you realize how far President Reagan's judicial legacy stretches, that judges from his first term in office, or his first year in office, are still there. He issued a temporary restraining order. He said, I think during the oral arguments or during his decision, that he thought the executive order was blatantly unconstitutional. This will now go through the Ninth Circuit. I think either way, whatever decision the Ninth Circuit reaches, most likely the Supreme Court's going to hear this question.
Right. I don't think there's any question. In fact, I would say that one thing that's really impressed me about the second Trump term is that where the first Trump term at the beginning was a complete circus. And I mean, not just a circus, but really a group of people who had no idea about what government actually does and how it works at the most basic sense. The second Trump administration is, again, I don't agree with every executive order. I don't agree with every step that the administration has taken. But in reading the executive orders, I've been pretty impressed by their professionalism, their grasp of what the legal issues are. And my guess is that, in fact, Trump's aim here was less to end birthright citizenship by executive order, although I'm sure he would have been delighted had he been able to do so, but more to throw this into the courts and get a decision up to the Supreme Court where his administration could then litigate it and potentially narrow the interpretation. So, I mean, that at least is my take. But I want to talk to you more about the theme behind all of this because it has further relevancy for the administration. Now we've seen that Trump has paused a lot of money flowing out of the government. In fact, I would say all money flowing out of the government, and it's been a real shockwave in Washington, D.C. He's used the authorities of the Impoundment Act. And I have two questions here, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about, his rights and privileges here.
Yeah, this is one of the sort of timeless questions in American constitutional government. Can a president refuse to spend money that Congress has authorized and appropriated? It goes back to almost the very beginning. I think Thomas Jefferson might be the first example of a president refusing to spend money, although I wouldn't have been shocked if President Washington had done it as well. In the 1970s, Congress passed a law, the Budget Impoundment Act. It was in the aftermath of Nixon, and it was one of the many, that sweeping era of bills attempting to constrain the president. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the War Powers Act, campaign finance laws, the Independent Counsel Statute. This Budget and Impoundment Act was another effort to constrain a president's power. while I just went on forever ago about presidents' responsibilities to enforce the laws, let's just be clear, there's always been discretion for a president to decide how best to enforce the law. I'm glad that, executives have some discretion when it comes to enforcing laws, or else I'd have a lot more speeding tickets. And we just know not every law is going to be enforced up to the maximum. And presidents and executives in all levels of government have always had some enforcement discretion. But presidents have always bristled under the limitations of the Impoundment Act. There's, for a very long time, been claims that Congress, in passing that law, unconstitutionally burdened the president's own executive power. We've seen other attempts at sort of pressure release valves on the budget, like the line item veto, which the Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional. And so now we might see a direct fight over the Impoundment Act. Because when President Trump's Office of Management and Budget put out its memo to the agencies this week, ordering them to not spend, they called it federal financial assistance programs. So not money that goes out directly to individuals, but money that goes out to other sort of intermediary agencies or organizations. As I read this little 2-page memo, it really does rest on the president's constitutional power to not spend or to delay the spending of funds that have already been appropriated. This too feels like President Trump sort of gearing up for a real constitutional fight. It's not clear who would bring the lawsuit. Congress can't bring the lawsuit. It would have to be somebody who's denied funds that they are legally entitled to. But we might see some clarity on this question about whether the president can constitutionally delay or altogether eliminate the spending of money that was appropriated by Congress.
So that is what brings me to this thematic question that we talked about right at the beginning of the podcast, which is just how do we right our ship? As I look back over these last 20 years, slightly less, what I see is that Congress has given up defending its own prerogatives. Right? That in fact, Congress, when Barack Obama tried illegally and was overturned by the Supreme Court unanimously to recess appoint individuals, Congress, at least his party, was like, whatever. Now, let me tell you, that was not the Congress that Mark and I worked in. We would have gone after a Republican and did indeed go after Republicans who infringed on our authorities because they were our authorities. And so our boss was very sensitive to this. Now that it's just like, you do you. And that's part one of it. But part two is that if you call, the progress of the last 20 years being that everything gets thrown to the courts, we now have the asterisk at the end of that, which is everything gets thrown to the courts, but then the president ignores the courts as well. Now, you being a good constitutional lawyer are going to say to me, right, and the remedy for that is impeachment. But there is no other remedy, as best I can tell. How do we fix this?
Yeah, well, you've definitely sketched out the problem. And I would say, to quote a friend on another podcast, it's even worse than that. Because let me just add a couple of notes to what you just pointed out, which is it's not just that the president is now sort of making all the policies. Every presidential election is the everything election. Every policy seems up for grabs. President comes to office with a burst of lawmaking power, most of which is in the form of executive orders. There'll be some legislation, but it's mostly, legislation from the executive branch. It doesn't just deform the executive branch, it deforms the rest of government, right? Congress becomes totally inert and reactive. And a lot of that has to do with political parties, but not all of it. But even with the courts, you said everything gets thrown to the courts. It's not just that it gets thrown to the courts, it's that it gets thrown to the courts immediately, right? Swift lawmaking through the administrative state creates even swifter judicial review. It's why we now have debates around the district courts and whether a judge in Seattle or a judge in Texas should be able to issue a nationwide injunction that governs the whole country outside of his or her own little district. Cases rocket up and down the dockets, right? The judge in the Birthright Citizenship case issues a temporary restraining order. Soon it'll probably be a preliminary injunction. Then there will be an appeal to the Ninth Circuit. There will be very quick calls for the Supreme Court to intervene. The courts are supposed to be slower and more deliberative, but the pace of administrative lawmaking and the malleability of administrative lawmaking, the fact that the president could change any of these executive orders tomorrow and create any new problems and maybe create new lawsuits, it means the courts have to move faster than ever. It makes the courts a worse version of themselves. And Congress, like I said, is just purely reactive. How do we get out of this problem? Well, there is impeachment, but one of the good trends I've seen in recent years out of the Roberts Court is an effort to, even while it's protecting sort of core executive power, as we saw in the presidential immunity case, the Roberts Court has done more and more to sort of make it harder for the president to be a lawmaker, right? You saw most famously they got rid of Chevron deference, which means the courts won't defer as much to an agency's policy judgments. The Roberts Court during the first Trump administration issued some decisions that made it harder for President Trump to flip-flop administration policy on immigration and actually on the census question about citizenship. Didn't say the Trump administration couldn't change those policies, just tried to slow down administrative change. So all the things the Roberts Court is doing to make the president a better executive but not as good of a legislator, I think those are good things. Like the ideal, and this is maybe the classic AEI, social, cultural, and constitutional studies ethos, if I may, would be that anything we can do to bring Congress back to the front of the conversation, to make it more of a policy maker and not just a sort of a court of public opinion where they hold hearings and complain about the administration or the administration's critics, is a good thing. And I think the Roberts Court has done a good job on that so far.
Exit question for me. So the Roberts Court really existed during the first Trump term because it was a 5-3 conservative majority. Now, with Trump's 3 appointments in his first term, we really have the Thomas Court in all practical purposes. Is the Thomas Court going to be different than the Roberts Court in these matters?
Well, you have seen the arrival of, like you said, of especially of Justice Amy Coney Barrett at the end of the first term. Maybe it's the Barrett Court, although I like Thomas quite a lot too. I think the court's approach will be similar to the Roberts Court last time. When you think about the court and the conservatives on the court, you have to think about a few different things at once. You have to think about how they read laws. You have to think about how they approach the pace of the court's work. Some justices like the court intervening very quickly on questions. Some, like Barrett and Roberts, actually have tried to slow down the court's work a little bit. And then finally, there's a question of precedent and how to deal with precedents in the area where the justices, even the conservative justices, will vary across a wide spectrum. I think on the whole, the Roberts Court will be similar to how it was last time, but a little bit more in the, as you said, in the Thomas direction, both in terms of how they read the law and in terms of how they think about precedent and in terms of how they think about the pace of the court's work. It'll be more like a Thomas version of the court, I think, and that's not a bad thing, but not particularly, enormously different from the first Roberts Court.
Adam, you have been exceedingly generous, excessively generous with your time, as we have sucked it all up, as we always do. But thank you a ton. This is a great conversation.
Oh, Mark, Danny, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
All right, Danny, what do you think?
Well, we really covered the sort of birthright citizenship issues and the executive administrative state issues as well at the beginning. But one thing you and I didn't talk that much about is the Impoundment Act. So, Washington is up in arms. First, Washington was up in arms when President Trump ordered all federal employees back to work.
Love it.
I love it too. And of course, strange bedfellows, Mayor of Washington, Muriel Bowser, loves it too because
downtown is dead. Businesses are collapsing.
As a taxpayer, I got to say, it really showed, by the way, that federal employees weren't coming back to work. Most people don't intersect with federal employees if they're lucky most of the time.
A lot of them moved away.
Oh, no kidding.
These people who are they get these high salaries because they live in D.C., and then they moved to lower cost of living jurisdictions and started working remotely, but kept collecting their DC pay. But you know what the good news for them is, Danny?
What?
They get if they decide to separate from the federal government, they get a taxpayer-paid 8-month vacation.
Well, but I think that's brilliant.
I think it is too.
I think
Absolutely.
that's
It's great.
I think
Take
that's
your
brilliant.
take your money and run. Go.
And I think that it's generous as
Yes.
well. Basically, you spent your life working for the federal government. You can retire, or you can take a buyout package, and
gone.
I think that's exactly the right way to deal with people. If you don't want to
You
work
could actually instantly cut the size of the federal government by 10%. I mean,
it'd be fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
I love
But I do think that in an example of a place where the Trump administration has shown some naivete is in these blanket pauses on all forms of money coming out of the federal purse. What they've done is set in place a whole series of unintended consequences that make them look silly. So, whether it's Medicare payments or it's the fact that we were helping pay to guard al-Hol camp with 10,000 members of ISIS in it in Syria. Right. You don't want to do those things, and they should have thought about some of that in advance. And I'm a little bit disappointed that they didn't, because it suggests that they don't know what they're doing in this thing.
Yeah, you may be right. Our friend Roger says you got to break a few eggs to make the omelet of democracy. So they're breaking some eggs and doing things a little bit ham-handedly in some ways. But I think they're erring on the side of action rather than precision. And that's going to come with some cost, but it's not necessarily the worst outcome. One thing that I think has been almost disorienting about this first week of the presidency, now 2 weeks of the presidency, is just how much the flurry of activity. I mean, we've got used to
It's amazing.
sleepy Joe Biden coming into the office at 10, leaving at 4, taking a nap, not being able to answer calls of world leaders for a month or two because he's,
we should have taken a buyout.
We should have given him a buyout. And all of a sudden, Trump gave a speech at the Congressional Institute the other day.
Oh, did he?
So a week in, which is the retreat of all the members, right? And he just listed a list of accomplishments of things he had done. And it was all from the first term, which means it had all been in the past 7 days. And it went on for like 15 minutes. I mean, he's signing executive orders, holding press conferences while he's doing it. I loved his rally where he signed the executive orders at the rally and then threw the pens out into the crowd. It's just a flurry of activity. I think people after the last 4 years are really excited that there's actually an active and engaged president who's trying to deliver on the things he promised. Even the things that I disagree with him doing, he promised them and he's delivering on his promises. And I think that that's overall a good thing, and there'll be course corrections where they're needed, but give the man a chance.
Yeah, well, listen, I agree with you about that, actually. And, yes, there have been some things that you and I both object to and think that Trump is wrong, but that's par for the course. It's good to see us have a president.
If we could just get a Congress.
Now we need to get a Congress. Exactly. Hey, folks, thanks for listening. Let us know what you think, too.
Take care.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.